we do that, maybe take a little search if we can find anything briefly for Inglehardt,
Okay.
just for a video.
Okay.
If it, and I haven't had a good one from before, but I haven't really looked.
For today, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, let's start. Ready on the video?
Okay.
Monday we talked about Genghis Khan and the as one big theme, and then LSR. And the way I presented it, I think I want to try to continue a little bit, even though this is more complicated. You're more sophisticated. The world has gotten more difficult in this cultural themes sense. There are many things that surround us that are not only two things fighting. There may be 5 things, and they're fighting something, and they're fighting against 10 other things. Okay, at least instead of saying it's messy, it's impossible, it's whatever. The main answer of the course is, let's try to trace some of the specific trajectories, themes, and dynamics over time across authors. So that is, sometimes it's within a country, like last time Russia and China. Other times it's the regions within the U.S. Other times it may be not the people or the institutions, it may be the interpreters. So we talked about Stalin making a film, Stalin actively talking about the film in 1937, 1943, in the middle of World War II. He's there investing his time and energy and money not in guns and artillery, but in a film. And he himself would fly in over helicopters over his troops, dropping stuff out and so forth. That is, he was very close to the troops, and it was a massive. It was the hardest part of World War II that the West didn't talk about, but the Germans really killed themselves, and as did the Russians. So lots of bloodshed. Okay. The way I want to introduce this time is to use Seymour Martin Lipset, not only a very, very smart guy in general, sociologist, Marxist in background, very smart New Yorker, taught at Berkeley, Columbia, Stanford, Harvard, and most of all, he changed his views. He learned over time and was explicit about doing this. The most visible case is at the back of his book, his most famous book called Political Man. And it's the afterword. I mean, 5 years later, 10 years later, 15 years later, he introduces how people criticized and disagreed with his book, and then how he then says, well, maybe Inglehardt, who's on our list, was a major critic of lipset and had an alternative, and he persuaded the lipset to move in that direction toward values and culture, which is the theme of this course. But where he started was not. He did not really use culture. The book was called Political Man, and he called it secular Marxism. So, what I want to do is go through some of the transformations. I mean, the biggest example was from lipset, which we'll see a little bit in the video. Then we can see in the exchanges with Elazar. Then I worked with I worked with each of these. I mean, I worked on co-authoring stuff with Elazar and with lipset and Inglehardt, or the three of them. And the four of us really met together for about 10 years. When this was such an unpopular topic that we were not on the programs of the professional associations of sociology or political science. Then it became more recognized, and so we stopped meeting privately. But it had an important way of talking with each other in a quiet hotel room, and saying, what if we dropped this and added that instead? And so that's the theme which I want to try to build on here. So let's see a little bit of lipset here. Here's his cover.
Seymour Martin Lipset, in your book, in the foreword, you write, "I will confess that I write also as a proud American." Why did you have to say that?
Because a lot of people who write books these days, a lot of intellectuals are not proud Americans. And I think there's probably more, as a nation, we're experiencing a tremendous wave of cynicism about American society. And a large part of that cynicism comes from the elite who project ideas, values, information.
If you could turn it up.
Well, they obviously don't have uniform sets of ideas. I think it is true that there's just probably more cynicism in the media elite, the intellectual elite, and in the public at large.
What makes you proud of America?
Well, I think it's as a country, and I think I tell something what I'm proud of in the book. I think it's a country which has done pretty well. We're the most democratic country in the world, which people don't know. An organization like the American Civil Liberties Union couldn't exist in almost every other country. Canada now can, because it exists because we have a Bill of Rights. The British don't have a Bill of Rights. The French don't have a Bill of Rights. And in fact, the democratic governments of Europe have much more power to arbitrarily interfere with people. During the student revolt in '68, Danny Cohn-Bendit, who was one of the leaders of the revolt, was booted out of the country by de Gaulle in 3 hours. He had no recourse. There's no court that he could have sued in to defend his rights. And our democratic rights of free speech, assembly, and the like, which are greater here than any other country, have been expanding thanks to various decisions of the Supreme Court. We're a country where social class differences, not economic differences, obviously are very great, increasing. But as Tuckville pointed out many years ago, there's more social equality in America. There's people in dealing with each other, there's more respect given to people because they're people regardless of rank and status. And this again I regard as a good thing. And so that there are a lot of aspects, not a lot of bad things about America. The subtitle of my book, is a double-edged sword. And by that I mean to imply that American exceptionalism, the way America is different, it's different in good ways and it's different in bad ways. In spite of the fact that the crime rate's going down, we have a higher crime rate than other countries. We have a lower voting rate than other countries. So that you can point to all sorts of things about this country, which I think most people would agree are not good, and a lot of things which are good. And the good things are, I think, in general outweigh the bad in my judgment, but one could argue the other way.
Where have you lived in your lifetime?
Well, mostly in the United States. I spent 3 years in Canada, different times. I spent a half year in Germany, a half year in Britain. I guess those are the longest stays.
What took you to Germany?
I was giving a course. I was teaching actually at the Free University in Berlin. I've been there shortest stays, but that was my longest stay in Germany.
And what took you to Canada?
Well, originally my first book and study was a study of a book called Agrarian Socialism, published I think in 1950. That was my doctoral dissertation at Columbia. And what happened was I was a young socialist at the time. I was interested in the question, which I still am, of why the United States is the only country, the only industrialized country which doesn't have a significant socialist movement or Labour Party. And Canada, which hadn't had one, suddenly developed one, then known as the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. And they won an election in the province of Saskatchewan and formed a government. And at that time, I thought Canada was more like the United States than I now think it is. I did a book about Canada and the U.S. and I pointed out a lot of differences between them, which I think help explain why Canada has a historically a socialist party of some significance. But in any case, I got a fellowship and went up to Saskatchewan for a year and studied the party, the government, and so on, and with a book called Agrarian Socialism.
You were a young socialist.
Right.
How did that happen?
How did it happen? Well, I guess I can explain in part how it happened. I grew up in the Bronx, New York. At the time, my father was a printer who was in the Typographic League, the organization I also did a book about. And he was a socialist of some kind. He wasn't very active in that. This was a Jewish working class area. I guess there was more garment workers than anything else. And really the dominant atmosphere around there was socialist. In fact, there was a park about a block away from where I lived, where on weekends the men used to gather, proverbially in Union Square in New York, and stand around people who were arguing and discussing. And the people who were arguing were communists, socialists, anarchists, Trotskyists, Leftoites, every variety of leftists you could think of. And I think one never heard about Democrats or Republicans.
Never heard of Democrats.
What did it mean to be a socialist?
Well, it meant at that time, and this was in the late 30s, late 30s, I was active when I was in high school. It meant that one thought that a lot of the problems, and at that time they were tremendous economic problems, mass unemployment, my father was unemployed on and off, most of the Depression, were the result of the system we call capitalism. And that the notion I thought, grossly simplified or wrong, that you could solve these problems by the government controlling the economy. And that part of the problem was caused by the fact that businesses have to make profit, and that profits don't continue indefinitely, and this leads to the whole question leads to recurrent unemployment, depressions, and so forth. And the solution to depressions was something called socialism. Of course, there were other factors, negative things around, like Nazism, Spanish Civil War, and the like. And at that time, as I said, the tensions, it's hard to recall, can recall it. It's not that hard, it's easy. I was, in all my career when I was a leftist, on what we know as the anti-Stalinist left, as the Trotskyists, socialists, anarchists, people who regarded the Soviet Union as a terrible place and were bitterly opposed to the communists. And so we spent a lot of our time, probably more time fighting the communists than we did fighting the capitalists or fighting the Democrats and Republicans.
Where would you put yourself on the political spectrum today?
Oh, I'm a moderate Democrat. I have an affiliation with the DLC, the Democratic Leadership Council, and its think tank, the Progressive Policy Institute.
In what way?
Well, I'm supposed to be a senior scholar at the Progressive Policy Institute, and they don't ask me to do very much, but what I do in writing about politics or society, I identify with them. And I've done things for them. I did some of it's in the book. I did a pamphlet on affirmative action, which I think is chapter 4 or 5 in the book. I did another thing for them on social democratic parties around the world. What's happened to them politically and left-wing movements. I've taken part in various conferences and meetings.
This is the same group that Bill Clinton and Al Gore and Dick Gephardt all started back in '84, '85.
Right. Clinton was head of it for 2 years. I don't think it's a secret that the DLC is not very happy with them, and probably vice versa.
Where do you teach now?
Well, I did teach for a long time in Stanford before that at Harvard, but I retired from Stanford. I was close to retirement from Stanford, and George Mason University in Virginia offered me a job. They were starting a new public policy school, and they offered me a position which seemed to be good. And also, I've written about politics all my life, but I've never lived in Washington prior to this stint at George Mason, and so that I thought coming to Washington would be interesting. Then I have a wife who, my first wife died, but my second wife is a fourth generation San Franciscan, who thinks, however, New York and Washington are much better places to live in San Francisco, which is the kind of thing that would shock both Easterners and Westerners.
You write in here about college professors, and you talk about some studies that show that college professors are, a lot of them are atheists.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that?
Well, intellectuality, it's a curious phenomenon. I've tried to explain in things I've written about and studied about professors and intellectuals why they're in the United States tend more to be on the left than other groups. I've not, thought too much about why they're atheists. That ties in, I suppose, with the conditions which make them leftists or make them sympathetic to various different kinds of leftist ideologies. Whether there's an inherent tension in rationale of an emphasis on intellectuality, on creative, scientific creativity, and belief in God. Empirically it seems to be so, but I don't know that one could argue it. There are plenty of religious scientists and other intellectuals, but I think compared to any other stratum in the population, that academics and intellectuals are more religious.
I wrote down a lot of things that you write about and how we're different than others. And by the way, define American exceptionalism.
Well, the term, as you know, was coined actually by Alexis de Tocqueville. It's just his famous book, Democracy in America. And Tocqueville, who was here in the 1830s, said America is exceptional, by which he meant it is qualitatively different than European countries, and particularly his native country of France. And then he listed all sorts of ways in which it is different. And many of the ways in which Tocqueville stressed the differences are still true, and a lot of those he didn't stress have become true, and some have declined. For example, we're an ideological country, a thing which Americans don't realize since they take their country for granted. But the United States was founded around an ideology. It was contained in the Declaration of Independence. And we talk about Americanism. And Americanism, in the sense of the American creed, Myrdal called it, is an ism, an ideology, in the same sense that liberalism or communism or socialism are isms. It's a set of values, a set of doctrines about the content and nature of the good society. And we've projected this on a population. We differ, we fight among ourselves as to what we mean by Americanism. But we have some unity about the notion that there are various American values. We talk about people being un-American, by which we mean that they don't believe in the American creed. They don't follow it. And one doesn't talk about people being un-German or un-Swedish or un-British. And the reason is the other countries, all other countries, are historical countries. What defines them is that they're people who live in the same areas, have a common culture, a common history, but not a common ideology, not a common value system. There was another ideological country, and that was called the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union, as you know, broke up. But and as an ideological country, we were, and to some degree still are, a revolutionary country. That is, we think we'd like the rest of the world to be like us, not be part of us. The Soviets thought of it, but to be like us. And several times I put it, before 1917, the time of the Russian Revolution, Washington was what Moscow was. That is, Washington was the center of the world revolution. And people who wanted to create democratic societies in Europe, overthrow the monarchy, overthrow dictatorships, would come to the United States for R&R. Garibaldi, Kossuth, Sun Yat-sen, all came here to rest up between the revolutions in their own country, but also to raise money. They'd go on national tours, and Americans would hail them and give them money because we thought Hungary or China or wherever should become a democratic country. For a long time, we were very ambivalent, I so ambivalent about Canada because we had this notion that somehow unfortunately still under the British monarchy, and this is a bad thing, and should end. So that well, beyond this aspect of what Americanism is in terms of different aspects of it, we also are the only Protestant sectarian country in the world. Tocqueville noted back in the 1830s that Americans were much more religious than other peoples. He was surprised at this. And if you read a lot of the foreign travel literature, books written by Europeans mainly who've come to the United States, that's an invariable comment they make about they can't understand how a country could be so religious. You raised a question about the atheism of the intellectuals, but what strikes these visitors is they don't find atheists in America, whereas there are plenty of atheists back home. Well, if you look at the data that we have now, and we have abundant survey data, public opinion data, the Americans go to church much more than people in other countries. They're more likely to believe in God. 95% of them or more say they do. They believe, 50% of them say they believe in the devil, and heaven and hell, and angels, and so on. You ask these same questions in Europe, you get 5%, 10%. And we're very, and the nature of our Christianity is different from that of Europeans. The majority of Americans belong to what are known as the sects, Protestant sects, the Methodists, Baptists, and hundreds of others. The overwhelming majority of Europeans belong to the churches, which are state-related hierarchical institutions, Catholics, Anglicans, Lutherans, Orthodox. And the churches are hierarchical. Parishioners are supposed to listen to what they're told by the hierarchy. The nature of the sects is that parishioners are supposed to read the Bible and make their own decisions. They hire their ministers, and the churches have to raise their own money. In the state churches, priests and pastors are and were and are civil servants. The Anglican Church, if you go to Britain, the Church of England is the state church. The churches are empty, literally empty. Almost nobody goes to church in the Anglican Church, Methodist, Baptist do. But the vicars get their money, they're civil servants. And this is true in a number
But
of
Ireland is the same thing, huh?
No, Ireland is different. I mean, there's a state church, but Ireland is one of the few countries in Europe where you have a high degree of Ireland and Poland's gone way down since communists were overthrown, are two countries where there's strong religious involvement. But in those two countries, Ireland and Poland, the church was an organization that was around which nationalism, national identity was organized. It resisted, in one case, Protestant rulers, in the other case, communist rulers, so that the Catholic Church in those countries maintained a great deal of strength.
What about in Israel? Are the rabbis paid by?
We quit there? Okay. He's giving you the big points. He went briefly on one thing. I'll just ask you to introduce if you like, and see what I have to say. He mentioned the values which made Americans different. What are those values? And these are people, as he said, he did not create these. He did a book called Democracy. I'm blocking on the book. It's an earlier book, and then he's revised it over time. But basically, he looks at the visitors of America from Tocqueville, the two most important were Tocqueville and then James Bryce at the end of the 19th century's ambassador from England. And they both were here a fair amount of time and enough to write a very, very thoughtful books. Harriet DeMartino and a couple of others. But these I have identified, and he then goes to survey research, such as he quotes on things like types of sectarian beliefs, belief in God, and the like. And he has 5 of these. these are good to put on your list. Anybody have these in mind?
Industrialization with no
A little bit louder?
industrialization with no socialist or workers party.
These are not specifically values, what you're mentioning. He has specific values, yeah?
I think he talks about the American creed, about liberty, egalitarianism, individualism, populism, and free market.
Exactly. Those are the 5. You all should know those and take those away. Because these are not just lipset. I mean, he's the mediating interpreter, but he didn't invent these. But you take these and then look, and then you can take them and you can look for institutional patterns. You can look at survey research and so forth, and then you can compare cities and neighborhoods and see how much they shift on these and how much these in turn connect to, let's say, Trump versus Biden. And both Trump and Biden have become a lot more complicated than the leaders within the Democratic and Republican parties. The biggest single shift, I would say, was Clinton. But Clinton really introduced social issues separately, especially racial tolerance. But he also included a populist style that let me add, as a Democrat, racial tolerance is not exceptional, it's normal. But what he then joined this with, which was unusual for a Democratic Party member, was what? In terms of fiscal policy. I'm asking because the mass media doesn't play this up very much, or hadn't, and 1 and 2. His own wife took a rather different position. Just to take one quick example. In one of the strongest states in the U.S. for unions is Ohio, and in the primary debate within the Democratic Party, Hillary Clinton was arguing with Barack Obama, and Barack Obama said, we should abolish NAFTA, which was created by Bill Clinton, because that's individualism and it's undermining the unions. And this is a bad thing. We should not have NAFTA. We should try to help workers in America. And who else has talked about that a lot? Donald Trump. Okay, so Trump's saying that and that is Trump has not said minimally unions are good, the way Biden would go and march with the United Auto Workers with a strike. But Trump has played up a lot. American workers should be favored, and we should have policies that support them a lot substantially more. Okay, so I won't try to make causal linkages, but what I'm pointing to are the degree to which these are taken seriously, Lipset's point, by both the Democrats and the Republicans. But the question is where and how to do it. And so one way that Lipset often earlier and earlier interpreters as well have stressed that the open conflict between rising up socially versus egalitarianism. And so the Horatio Alger is an image of the poor guy who rose socially and economically as a classic image of the American workers. And you don't have that at all in the same way, or in a popular manner in Europe. So he then he then did another book with Reinhard Bendix, comparing the European countries with the American countries, with the U.S. And sort of testing the idea that Horatio Alger is stronger here. That is, that more poor people get richer, and that could be the answer to the big question by the German socialists of why is there no socialism in America. And this is frequently been invoked, that because we don't have a peasantry, we never had a peasantry or an aristocracy. Everybody's sort of middle class in that sense. We're small farmers now. 1900, great majority were still farmers. So the news which Lipset came up with was the U.S. did not have a higher social mobility rate. That poor working class family background, French, German, English, were about the same as Americans. So Horatio Alger in that sense was a myth, but nevertheless, many Americans believe in that when you ask them about these issues. One. Two, a related point is the definition of inequality and what's the other term? It's in a sense, it's the meaning, it's the implication in the policy of egalitarianism and how it works. The American view is that success, or the American dream in that sense, is that everybody should be able to rise on and play on an equal playing field, and that the government should be there to make the playing field free. Is the classic view. By contrast, the European conception of socialism, or making the state and policies more favorable on the left, is to increase, is to decrease inequality of income. So in that sense, there's a okay, I won't try to elaborate too much, but there are many tables and other sources which you can look at, but these are corollaries of these 5 beliefs, which is what I'm trying to give you to try to work through and then see where and how these are supported or not. He tends to, so he's talked about, and I don't want to, well, he makes it sound, as you said, I'm a proud American and so forth. He's very tough and critical of every group, including Jews, he's a proud Jew, but he's also very critical in different ways in which a Jewish intellectual style is also to be more critical and to join that with prophecy. And so Jesus Christ, who was Jewish, came that from the section which is in the canvas readings, if you want. Go down. It's in the section. I think it's on empires. But it's the section. I have some good sections in there from the book Ancient Judaism, including then the introduction of a forceful, continual criticism of the establishment, which the ancient Jews tolerated. And that's a critical point. Not only did they have them, they didn't just kill them off, that is in Egypt and Syria and most of the rest of the world, and through the colonial era, through the 19th and 20th century. If you had colonialists in Africa who were really really critical, they hung them, they shot them. Whereas in England, so follow up quick question here. Which leadership built the largest empire in the world? Okay, the first answer is on ground together, that is without including overseas. So if the first answer is on the ground, including China and Russia and getting into Iraq and Iran, you know the answer from last week. Genghis Khan and his followers. If you include the overseas colonies, what's the largest empire in the world, historically? The British. Okay, so the British, including especially India. So India was the big, massive example of the British colonial empire, and the British colonial administration permitted so Marty talked about the Church of England. People don't go to church and they're not really religious, but they're called the nonconformists, Methodists, Presbyterians in Scotland and the like. They have been historically very active inside the British colonies. So they would go to India, they would go to South Africa, they would translate the Bible into Swahili, they would build schools so Africans could go to school for the first time. They would learn to read, and they would learn to read the Bible. And this was done not by the British colonists, not by the Africans themselves. This was done by British religious non-Church of England, and what did Max Faber label these? Marty did not mention it, but you should know the important link here. Calvinists, all these people. So Lipset talked about the sects, S-C-C-T-S, but the sects. These are the classic critical part of the Calvinist organization in Switzerland and the Netherlands, where this were strongest, is that they elect the top leaders of the church. And what's the name that they have, which is we also know from Chicago? Alderman. So alderman is really a Dutch Calvinist term, which even though you would not, I mean, this is an Irish Catholic city predominantly, but the aldermen is the legal term which we still use, and there's still aldermen, even though many women are in the Chicago City Council, but they'll still use aldermen as their title. Okay. So, five values. How is this very different from Eleazar we talked about on Monday? Lipset does not trace back the history. He starts with American history, but he doesn't go back to Europe. Eleazar is the opposite. So Eleazar, he has these three streams of culture. Okay, that's one critical difference. Lipset also has one image of America. He deals, and so you can look for things which are shared by Americans, as he talks about very, very creatively. But he leaves out the regional and local differences within America, which are so stressed by Eleazar, including the New Englanders, the Middle Atlantic, and the South. And this is a background for a lot of the battles which are still going on. When I was about 9 years old, my family had come from the north. We'd gone to the south, and I was in a sandbox There was a silence, and two other guys said, "Gee, ain't it too bad we lost the war?" I wasn't too sure what I should say, but I didn't say anything. Okay. I've been trying to figure it out ever since, what that means for me and for others. Okay. But Lipset doesn't ask that question. He doesn't think about it. And many of the interpreters are so, and I would say on this campus in particular, we have people who are such good damn Yankees. they omit the South. But why do I play that up? Because the South, conflicting with the rest of America, helps you begin to understand the differences between America and the rest of the world, especially the politics of clientelism. Clientelism and hierarchy are classic, and Lipset played that up. I mean, having this, there's this individualist Bill of Rights, this kind of thing is very, very strong here. It's just okay. So the point of not having that, and instead concepts of honor. Honor is much more widespread in the world, and is critical in the South, but is not in New England. So in that sense, the dissing is important to I mean, the dissing is what's going on in the Ukraine, and especially even more, I would say, with Israel in the Middle East. I mean, they 1,000 years ago they killed us. We're going to get back to them. That's 1,000 years later. I mean, these are, in that sense, I would say, in my visits to parts of the world, in particular, I'd say in particular in Israel, talking to people in the Middle East. I'm very pessimistic about anything ever changing, but I shouldn't pessimistic in the sense of finding a consensual, reasonable solution which the various sides will agree upon. I guess the other reason I would add to that, in extending what Lip said about intellectuals. When I first went I wanted to study is there a real conflict between capitalism and democracy or not? And so I wanted to see, how does communism work in practice? Not just reading about Marx and Lenin, but how do people treat each other? How do they administer the specifics? And I tried to get into East Germany, and they wouldn't give me a visa. So I was able to get to go to Yugoslavia, and in Yugoslavia they were very proud to have in the period under Tito, to try to have reasonably, and this was seen around the whole world as being the most successful example of a communist, strong socialist, not just Swedish welfare state, but part of the Soviet bloc with the Russians. Tito was there, but at the same time they talked about and wanted to foster democracy. Okay, where could this work, and was this just garbage and propaganda, or did it in fact work in practice? And so I'd say in that that's clear and easy. What shocked me was seeing the degree to which intellectuals themselves, top planners, top academics, lawyers, constitutional, legal scholars, mayors, well, I shouldn't say mayors, I mean but let's say intellectuals. The great majority of the persons in Yugoslavia in different republics were very proud of their republic. So the Serbians and the Croats and the Slovenes hated each other. And that was more important than being Yugoslav and really hating the Germans or the Russians or the Americans or the English. I think it was something like 20% of the whole population of Yugoslavia died in World War II. graveyards are all over the place. They were not killed by the Germans or the Russians. They were killed each other. The Croats killed them. That is, there were branches of them that were different, political, left and right. Left and right is too simple, but were linked with usually little subgroups, and they'd march all the village members. Again, remembering Genghis Khan, they'd march 200 people into a church. They'd burn down the church, and they'd kill anybody who came out of it. That's it. And this was in 1940, 45. This is 20th century. Okay. And I would say it's medium so that way with intellectuals in Western Europe, but they are, I'd say, qualitatively different, with Americans being more critical of the United States, and that maybe in part. I mean, Lipset didn't mention, but one of the part of that residue is the conception that you could be un-American and specifically have a House Un-American Activities Committee, and that was a major alienating kind of activity, leading many Americans to say, I'm critical of America. And many of the Europeans who were here were leftists, or that is, you had to, if you wanted to teach at the University of California, you had to what was called sign a loyalty oath that you never worked for or were a close friend, acquaintance of a Communist Party member. You cannot work for the state of California. I think it's a state, including the university. Okay, and that was a very controversial policy, which alienated people. Whereas, okay, so I'll simply say, Lipset has two big chapters in the book. One is on intellectuals. It's Jews. I'm confusing it with the other book. In Political Man, there's a chapter on the chapters on intellectuals. I would say in some ways that's almost more original. If you want to, if you're okay, it's there if you're interested. What I said I want to use as a leitmotif through this tour of Lipset is the conflicts and the changes, which he made it sound very simple and low key. And he said, and I grew up and there were people, they were, it was tough in the battles. Okay, and so if you want to see more of that, there's a terrific film which I and Andreas Glazer and others have used in classes here, is called Arguing the World. And it's really on Marxism in America, and it involves Lipset, Daniel Bell, and others who were New York Jewish intellectuals who went to, what he's talking about was called Alcove 1, which is where the Stalinists were, and Alcove 2 were the Trotskyites, and they were, and some were anarchists and others, but basically they were non-Soviet, non-Stalinist Marxists, and so he did not mention when Pearl Harbor came along in 1941. The U.S. was bombed. Then the Americans said, "Okay, we're declaring war," and so immediately that day after, Lipset and Peter Rossi had spent they were both in Alcove 2. They argued with each other, should we defend capitalism? This is the worst, this is the leading capitalist country in the world. It should be crushed. And so Peter Rossi joined the army. Lipset did not. He never fought in World War II. So in that sense, in that sense, he had an emotional, ideological anger against, you know, so strong that he refused to fight in World War II. He didn't mention that. But that, I mean, that, in earlier, I mean, that, okay, so I'd say that, it drove him, he intellectualized that really, to try to pursue those analytical questions. And it wasn't, for him, it was not a personal issue. It was, why was there no socialism there, and how did he mentioned briefly a paper he did on socialist parties around the whole world. And this is what I worked on with, was class. So we published a paper called "Are Social Classes Dying?" Very controversial. I still get, you know, thousands of citations and people, you know, looking up, exploring, arguing about this, especially Latin America, Eastern Europe, where these are very hot issues right now. We had a series of conferences over roughly 10 years, and people arguing back and forth. And there was multiple books, but the most important one was called "The Breakdown of Class Politics," which Lipset and I co-edited, and it fits in with these other themes. But we had open, you know, the smartest people at Berkeley and at Oxford were leaning toward Marx and toward the use of class and stressing class interpretations. So we tried to we'd be in the same room, you know, and we worked together, and over 10 years, some of the more elderly withdrew a bit, but the Young Turks were very smart and very creative, and we learned from each other. And we had a minimal amount of ideological disagreement. These were not seen as things that people would, you know, sitting in a different chair would take a different view. Say, yeah, let's test it. Let's, you know, how can, if we take that kind of argument, so everything that Lip said, I mean, the way he answered those questions almost never was, my mother said that, or she said, you know, we'd be spanked. What he said is, what's the data? What's the evidence? How can we test those views that Americans are not religious, Americans are this and that, and so forth. So the questions by the interpreter, Ladd, was trying to draw him out on a more personal. He would pose a personal question. He would answer usually with systematic data about America, not about Marty Lipset. So I'm using him in the same way, not because, yes, he does happen to be a major social scientist, but the more interesting, but I'm adding then, he changed over time, and third, that in turn illuminates where and why other people take, and people, countries, and cities, and then regions within the U.S. have those divisions, 1 and 2. I'm making an additional point. These have become more important today to maintain, to be able to see all these things going on, even within the same person, within Biden, within Trump, within Haley. I mean, where and how these things get variously played up or played down, and how even so, and especially in this campus. I mean, we've got one of the distinguishing marks of making the USC different from Harvard, Yale, Stanford, is we've got more diversity in arguing among the students, and certainly the faculty as well. But I'd say the exciting and interesting thing is with the students who are searching for truth, or you know, doing this the right way, drives them to explore these issues seriously. Alex Inglis was on the faculty at Columbia, Harvard, he'd been in Chicago and Stanford, and I said, what's the difference between these institutions in terms of their faculty discussion? People at Harvard argue about the front page of the New York Times. People at Stanford talk about mountain climbing last weekend. People at Chicago and New York Columbia, CCNY. They talk about their work and maybe about political issues, the way lipset is done. So in that sense, there's an intellectualization and joining it with work. Whereas the earlier, at least through the 50s, you could say, I can get A's, but I don't do any work. That is, there's an anti-work ideology, at least within the Ivy League, which was not the way or is generally not the way at Chicago. Okay. Brilliant Nobel Prize winners don't really boast about not doing any work. They work all the time. Okay. And there are a lot of Nobel Prize winners here that you can take courses from and learn from and look for these kinds of things. Okay. Could we find anything on Inglehardt?
No, I couldn't find any videos of like him talking.
Okay, we'll give up. Okay, what's the big point that Lipset was arguing with him and that Inglehardt? Why are we reading Inglehardt? Did several books, but Marty used to. I don't think he would maybe in person more than in print. He only has one big idea, but the point is Marty himself said Inglehardt is really right, and he changed Lipset's views substantially. That the values are important, and he was a student here in. I'm not even sure if it was political science or something. I think he was in political science. But he worked at the National Opinion Research Center, and he worked with Duncan McCrae, who was professor of sociology here, but his background training was in physics. So he had a sense of science, physics, and survey research, which is across the Midway, NORC, and using surveys. So he spent his whole career, as Lipset has done a lot, on national surveys of citizens. And what he saw, what Inglehardt saw, was the emergence of multiple kinds of values. So Lipset, during those years, he was still thinking in terms of economic. He was closer to Marxism. He was a secular Marxist still. And so I would talk with Inglehardt and say, let's fight with these people. Let's make this point. So I was for 10 years I was arguing with Lipset in ways that we would usually disagree with this stuff. He then moved reluctantly, but he had changed by the time he's talking here. So here he's very clear on stressing values. He did not 10 or 20 years before. Okay, so that came from Inglehardt. How did Inglehardt show that these values were important? One thing which he added, which was perhaps growing up in a later era than Lipset. One of his ideas is if people grow up in either a family, a city, and a political era like the Depression versus the 1950s. The sense of depression, and I know this by my own parents and others of that generation, the Depression really marked their entire lives. That is, helping people out of poverty, and how can we help poor countries become more affluent and successful and give more opportunities to their populations. Okay, so Inglehardt said, yes, but that's the past. That we now have people who have grown up with some of them with more affluence, and they don't worry about having a little more money. And if you don't worry about having food, shelter, and the very simple basics, how do you change? And his basic argument was, we have, and is here and in his other books, he said, you have, he had different labels for it over time, but he measured these initially with 4 items, 4 survey research items. 2 of them were, how important is it to have the national government help people get out of poverty, and how much should we try to you know, over, that is, they're both economic, helping the disadvantaged. The other two were lifestyle. One was more about in favor of democracy, and the other was in favor of beauty. Beauty, okay. So the point was, he found a lot of people who answered beauty and democracy. They didn't worry about poverty. Okay, so these then he divided into two types, and said, and then looked for what proportion of the population followed these tendencies within the U.S., within France, within Russia, and then over the years, he then started the World Values Survey. So he started with the U.S., Michigan, but the World Values Survey was the largest pioneering, serious, consistent survey study of Americans, of citizens around the world. And it has roughly up to 120 countries covered. And not all of them include all 120, but they work together and they change the questions. The big point in addition is they repeat the same questions over 2 years, 4 years, 8 years. So you can see how much is there change in Egypt, in Israel, and so forth, in ways that clearly can lie, but people can lie in every country. And the question is, you know, if you bias, you know, how do you interpret this? There's a lot of work on so there are dozens and dozens of books exploring these kinds of issues. Then NORC here then followed the World Values Survey and has done what's called first the General Social Survey, the GSS, and the ISSP. The ISSP is the international branch of NORC. So the ISSP and the World Values Survey are the best are the only serious, systematic, over time surveys in the world, and the people who are really wanting to look at this use those data. Okay, so there's an excellent, there are 3 pages. You get 3 pages. We don't have a video, but we've got a 3-page summary of Inglehardt that was published about just a couple of months ago in The Economist magazine. And it's not only Inglehardt, it's the people who continued that legacy of using those kinds of data and writing those books, continuing and testing and critiquing it. But there are three individual pages. Listing is listed as 3 files there because that's the only way. But it's short, crisp. Take a look. Okay. So the okay, because this is not just lipset, but because we can lipset, we can look at other drivers of how these perspectives have broadened. How did he move from a Marxism to a secular Marx to begin to, that is, and so Marx himself was a journalist. He worked for New York City newspaper, and he covered European news. And one was why the Irish workers did not side with the British workers, and why didn't they, as Marx said, and where proletariats should revolt together. The Irish workers didn't want anything to do with the British workers. They hated the English. They wanted Irish leaders, and nationalism, Irish nationalism, was their shared view. And Lipset mentioned there are only 2 countries, Poland and Ireland, that are more religious than America in the West. And in that sense, the Irish were religious just as the Poles were religious. So the Poles hated the Russians and the Tsar. The Irish hated the English because they were colonizing, you could say, or they would talk about that in terms of Ireland now having the autonomy, and so they were I mean, they were still violently using terrorist tactics within England and within the British. It's still going on in Northern Ireland right now. Okay. What was Marx's term for this view? I, the Irish workers, don't side with the proletariat. The English. If you want to close a little bit, if it's too cold for you, it's fine. Maybe close half of what's there. That would be fine. Okay. So this is a. Maybe okay. Leave that one. Leave that shut and maybe leave halfway the other one open. That's great. Okay, that's fine. Answer: false consciousness. It's a classic Marxist concept. But it includes, its topic is the same as what Lipset talked about. Values. The values of nationalism, patriotism, were so important that, but Marx didn't talk about that. I mean, they were not part of the scientific laws of progress in Marxist terms. And so what we changed in Lipset was to incorporate values in ways that Marx said you can't and shouldn't do. So there was not only was it the people from the 30s, the people who grew up in the say roughly the 68 era, your faculty, let's say, were 50 years old, 40s, 50s, 60s, maybe, something like that. Many of them had or maybe have Mush Pustone as an example. He's a historian. He was head of the college section, and he wrote a book. He and I both studied in Frankfurt with the Frankfurt Adorno Horkheimer Marxists. And in that sense, Pustone, and I'm using him just to say that he is a concrete example that this is not something I'm inventing, and on campus. Incorporated, that is, who persisted in saying we don't want to use culture as a serious independent variable. Where and how did Lipset change? Surrounded by people who, so I'm saying the two simple causes in interpreting this, and this is the interpretation I'm now giving you from Inglehardt. So Inglehardt said, if you grew up and you didn't have money, then you want to have money. If you grew up and you had money, then you want beauty or democracy or something else, some social other issue than just money or materialistic success. The second period I'm just adding, which you can see in faculty around you, not only, but stronger, because Daniel Patrick Moynihan did what's called the Moynihan Report, roughly soon after 1968. And this 68, big year. Lots of people became the era of the Vietnam War and the mobilization of civil rights and the implementations of some of Martin Luther King egalitarianism, but battles still going on. And then unionization drives by civil servants. That is, governments could generally not be a union member in the 1950s. In the national government, local government, state governments. That changed, and we now have that. It happened in Chicago most visibly and violently with Jane Byrne, with the firemen doubling the size. Okay. People growing up in that era often then either became Marxist or strong socialist or critical Adorno invented the term critical theory. It's not sociology, it's not political science, it's not philosophy. It's critical. In that sense, it's ancient Judaism. It's prophetic. That is, read what I have in the selections underlined of Max Weber on the ancient prophets, and that's what you can still see in Postone, you can see in Adorno, you can see in which you had earlier. And so lipset, okay, so it's there, and it's okay. The Inglehardt then followed up with analyzing more, such as in this book, and the summarizing, well, the where and why do values rise or decline, and which specific values change the political system and behavior. And one of the most important, for example, was abortion and women and their bodies, especially in, well, and this is clearly here with Trump now, with the Republican primary going on over these issues. But this is also true with others he explored in the Middle East. So I mentioned briefly. I'll just mention very briefly again. A famous case. Muslims who moved to Denmark, cousins, brothers, sons, had one young lady who had a boyfriend and or either might think about, I'm not sure if it was to marry, but at least to be close with him. And a minor, that is, let's say a 15, 16-year-old young member of the family, killed her. And so the Danish court then said, 12 of you are going to jail. That is, because normally you choose someone who's below age, and so they don't go to jail or whatever. Whereas the Danes were really following or implementing this kind of value of women's rights in a strong test case, and as there, and this is still being fought out across in Western Europe, where we now have, if a majority, either a very near majority or an absolute slight majority in Germany and the Netherlands are now Muslim. Most Germans are now Muslim. Okay, this is. The U.S. press does not talk about this, but it's there. And ironically, because these two countries, especially with what's her name, the Prime Minister of Germany, was very strong in favor of tolerance and wanting to overcome the huge guilt that the Germans generally have in their political system, to overcome the World War II and the genocide legacy. She was seeking to, and it passed enough for a good 10 or 15 years, that Germany was very open in permitting millions of immigrants to come to Germany. And so the Germans fought with many of the other European countries who did not want that many or any, but the Netherlands and Germany were very hospitable to immigrants, including particularly Muslims. Okay, but these tested, but the Dutch are the most extreme, because in the sense they were the most Calvinist, the most egalitarian, the accessible, but with when one Muslim was running for mayor of Amsterdam, he was arguing against his candidate, who was a gay sociologist professor, and he was murdered. And so in that sense, he was murdered because he was saying, if the other man is elected as mayor, gays will not be able to practice or be recognized as appropriate, having a different lifestyle, and you should not vote for him as mayor, and clearly, so this is a social issue. It's not about money. Okay, all right. So but the Netherlands has now, and the Germans are following this in part. These are becoming more difficult, heated issues, but they're not the simpler past issues. These things, killing a daughter, killing your sister, etc. So you don't necessarily have to have people killed, but these are hot issues. Okay, these are the big points I want to make. Let me. I'm talking a little longer than I want to, but I can't generally get you folks to throw out a lot of questions, but I'll try. Throw out a question. I can ask you a question, but any thoughts on what I've said? And again, 90% of what I've said is not original to me. I'm trying to pass this on to you. I'm trying to give you more context for lipset, for Inglehardt, in ways that this matters around the world.
I don't have a question, but it's more of like an observation that for
Sure.
me, something that I'm actually thinking about writing a memo on this, but something that is very interesting for me is, well, how in Brazil, Bolsonaro very often use the US as like this symbol, and he would very often,
As what?
he would
Maybe
use,
don't you put your message.
that's because I'm with a cold, so I'm afraid I might
Okay.
spread out to other people.
Okay.
But he would use like the US as like his main goal, so his goal was to kind of make Brazil, kind of Americanize Brazil, and he would often use like the American flag and like American, like, for example, like, oh, God bless America, he would say that in his like speeches in Brazil, but at the same time kind of hold the very nationalist value. So for me, it's very interesting to think how his supporters will support both the Brazilian nationalism, but also the American nationalism, which for me is kind of very conflicting. So I don't know. I think it's a very interesting idea, especially when you think about those values that make the U.S. more exceptional. So I don't know. I find that very interesting.
I agree. I hadn't heard about that for Brazil.
And in his supporters, after he lost the election, they were protesting, and we had the January 8th, like what you had here, and they would go using American flags and flags of the U.S. and like, which was very surprising for me. So, yeah.
Okay. No, that's good point. I mean, nationalism for sure is hugely important around the world, but to use another major alternative in the way you described is interesting. Is there anything? I mean, any follow-ups that you want to add to interpret it? Is people? I mean, what do people in Brazil say about this?
Well, I never really thought of this before, like this class, so I feel like it would be interesting to probably go back to the readings and try to understand what each author would say about that. But I feel like in Brazil, what authors say about that is that first it's very recent, so very few people are already writing about that from like an academic point of view. Rather, journalists are writing about that, but they just point out the contradiction.
But what did the journalists say, or especially the leaders who were doing that? That is, they presumably there was if he was president, prime minister, whatever, he won. I mean, people voted for him. Why?
Well, a lot of people say.
What's the average Brazilian think of America? Which
When average Brazilian think of Americans
yeah.
or of
And
both
the flag, yeah.
Well, I think like
And the use of the flag in that context, when he was, I think you told us, his major backer was what you call the Union of Evangelical
Right.
Brazilians.
right.
And that's his key party here.
And I think it has a lot to do with the idea that was mentioned in the video of lipset, that is this idea that an average American will be able to socially rise and have like social mobility. So I think this idea is not present just in the US but also in other parts of more of the global South countries that I have visited and have been to. Because I've been, for example, in Argentina with Brazilians and with Americans, and people convey their ideas to you in a very different way. So I think there is this conception that the US as a country is this country of like the opportunities, and like a lot of people want to come here and they want to immigrate. So I think that the flag has this meaning, this meaning of if we become the US, then we also can have like social mobility and have a better life. Because also when they think of Americans, they think of white Americans. They don't think of like diversity, for instance. So they don't think that the US has issues with racism or issues with other social matters, They think of the very stereotypical image of how the country should be because that's what they want in Brazil as well. So.
I worked with no, go ahead.
I just wanted to kind of like comment on that because you said earlier in the class, well, I don't know, like this whole thing, the whole idea of like the American dream, because it was said like earlier in the class that this sort of like Horatio Alger idea just isn't accurate and that it has like similar social mobility to like France and other countries. So then, because I mean that's clearly like a very powerful idea of like social mobility, like politically, but if it's not accurate, then like do people just ignore the data then and just? Cause, I mean, I agree with Stefan. It's like a very appealing idea of having social mobility, but it seems to not actually be based in reality. I don't know.
I think people don't know it's not true,
Yeah, no, I was very surprised by the statistics which you said.
It shocked everybody.
Yeah, I always assumed it was somewhat overplayed, but
Yeah.
that to be similar to like France and Germany, that's very surprising.
Something that shocked me, similarly about Brazil, and that we worked with a guy who was the head of coordinator of the cities, the big cities of Brazil. There are about 20, they have urban observatories of Sao Paulo, so forth. And the one finding was happiness. And the Brazilians say, and poor Brazilians, low-income Brazilians, say they're much more happy than many people around the rest of the world, including Americans. So people may be poor, and people may say it's nice to have. So in a sense, that's a conflict between the if they mean America means you want to rise, that conflicts with the fact that a lot of poor Brazilians say they're happy the way they are. So these are fascinating issues.
These are, but I believe that those Brazilians that are with the American flag, they are not the poor Brazilians that, they have this idea of happiness. I think these are the middle, high, like Brazilians with like a higher, like higher earnings, for example, rather than poor Brazilians.
Now, what do they say or do that makes them different, that are higher?
Well, their income.
No, but yeah, that's what's that causing? What's that related to that you're making? I'm missing your main point.
Well, yeah, and I don't know that answer, but I feel like we're talking about different groups. We have the one group that said there's the poor Brazilians that believe that happiness, they are happier, and I also think that's part of the image that people have of Brazil abroad. That a lot of Brazilians are poor but still very happy and are always dancing and singing, whatever. And you have like our, middle class, middle high class Brazilians that like once in their life maybe visited either New York or Orlando, and they just went to the touristic part, which happens very often, and then they see, wow, everyone here is like this, and because the goal for most
but
of them.
what you haven't made explicit why it's interesting. That is, did they change when they visited New York and they went back to Brazil, what did they say? That they're angry about Brazil and we don't feel,
I think their sense is they want to make Brazil the U.S.
okay, so they want to have more active individual
Right.
values, which Lipset had talked about,
Right,
and
I
that's
believe
why they're
so.
holding up the flag.
I believe
Because
so.
those, okay, now I'm with you.
This is a point.
Yeah, because those five do not explicitly stress material success. It's the value of doing well and rising socially is the driver rather than the money in specifically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just one question. Do you think it's like the values because of the assumption that then that will lead to prosperity, or the values themselves? Like, I think it's just for the sake of the values?
I don't think it's for the sake of the values.
Okay, that's kind of what I was thinking, where it's more so just for like the idea of like prosperity. 'Cause like I said,
And this one is kind of conflicting. So.
Yeah.
It's kind of what?
Conflicting.
Conflicting, yes.
Because the values that we had for lipset, they are the values for the sake of the values, right? Not for materialism. But what's conflicting with the idea of Brazil that is also for materialism, but not just for the sake of the values. So.
Okay. Good issues. Good, excellent case to bring in, which I don't have the answers for at all, but thank you for raising it, and let's watch out.
And I'm sorry for taking 10 extra minutes.
Yeah, we'll have class on